Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. It's been a great day thus far. I hope everyone's getting a lot out of our talks and panels here throughout the afternoon. I just wanted to come up here and introduce our next panel, specifically our moderator, Quinn Carlson. He is the Director of M&A at Duff Phelps, has many years' experience in M&A and corporate development as well, and he's going to lead our panel here with our other experts.
Terrific. Thank you. As Brendan mentioned, I'm a Director of M&A at Duff Phelps, where you may have heard my colleague Elise Bluth earlier today. I focus principally on M&A, mostly in the industrial, manufacturing, and distribution sectors. And I'm delighted to have some of our panelists here representing local, large corporations as well as a private equity fund. Talk about corporate development. So I guess maybe the first thing I'll do is maybe turn it over to Lee. Introduce yourself and then also define your role.
Sure. Thank you, Quinn. Lee Wise, Mead Johnson Nutrition, headquartered locally here in Chicago, of course. Vice President of Business Development. So in that context, within Mead Johnson, it's handling mergers, acquisitions, investments, joint ventures, anything strategic in nature in terms of a transaction. So we do that on a global basis here from Chicago. For those who are unaware of Mead Johnson, we're an infant formula company, so pediatric nutrition is all we do. One brand, one focus. So it's a tight market for us to focus M&A on.
Okay. Michael?
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Teplitsky. I'm with Wynnchurch Capital. Wynnchurch is an industrial private equity fund headquartered in beautiful Rosemont, Illinois, a little bit north of here. And we really focus on buying businesses through the economic cycle, and as a result of that, we buy both very healthy businesses and underperformers and companies that are in distress or undergoing some sort of a bankruptcy. And my role there is to really find the deals and then work on the deals and get involved in doing acquisitions and then the ultimate sale of the company.
I'm Don Bartholomew, and I run corporate development for Huron Consulting. We're focused, about half our business is in healthcare. We're also in education, life sciences, legal advisory, and a little bit of business advisory. So we're traded on NASDAQ, so we're about $800 million in revenue.
Excellent, thank you. We heard earlier Professor Morissette talk about the 4 pillars of essentially an effective M&A strategy, starting with strategy, corporate development, M&A, and then ultimately integration. And I'm curious of the panelists that we have, maybe you can spend a little bit of time just telling us how much time you spend on strategy development versus corporate development versus executing the M&A, and then how far do you get involved in as it relates to the integration of the target?
From my perspective, strategy is first and foremost. We spend a great deal of time coordinating with the really global marketing who runs the strategy process within Mead Johnson. And so we sit with them and try and help articulate, what markets are we going to address, where's our focus going to be at. And we are a focused company on pediatric nutrition, so it's pretty easy to come to those decisions. The questions become later in the future, how far do we go to adjacencies? That usually comes with a pileup of cash, which we're seeing right now. And where does that go? But for us, executing M&A strategy is really building upon the corporate strategy and figuring out how we can help execute that. So if it's building a presence in a country we're not at, can we gain greater scale via an acquisition of a platform company, manufacturing process, you name it. So everything we do is focused on strategy. And from my personal standpoint, it's probably 50% of my time. But we'll take the deal, shepherd it, and kind of run an integration team alongside of it during a diligence and a deal acquisition stage, and still hold the reviews afterwards. So post 30, 60, 90, 36-month type reviews. So that'll all run through our group.
I guess maybe a question for Dawn. We also heard Professor Morissette talk about some of the decision biases that exist within an organization. How do you remain in your role as in charge of corporate development? How do you remain unbiased, and how do you counter some of those decision biases that exist in an organization?
Sometimes it's actually pretty difficult. We're kind of run more like a portfolio company where each of the business leaders, the head of healthcare, is pretty much, given a lot of control on how they want to run their business. So sometimes we've encountered that where they're very passionate about a deal, and I'm coming in and saying this does not make financial sense, or we've got some deal killers here, and it becomes quite contentious. So it's a difficult way to do it. It's really, a lot of it kind of comes down to making sure we've got the right numbers and the support and the data that goes behind why we're making the arguments, and offering the alternatives for ways we can restructure the deal or put something in to kind of protect us from what we're kind of seeing as some of the red flags. But it's interesting because the CFO said that to me actually the other day. He says, I realize you're in a really tough spot because you're usually on the front line. So he kind of helps out too, like stepping in when he needs to.
One, the holy grail in private equity, corporate development, beyond just generating great returns for shareholders and for your LPs is getting proprietary deal flow. And it happens.
What is that?
Well, exactly. So it does happen, and I'm curious to know, maybe for Michael, how do you, position Wynnchurch in those discussions? How do you generate, proprietary deal flow for acquisitions, for platforms, or perhaps for add-ons to the existing portfolio?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. I'd say, look, obviously we want as limited of a process as possible, and don't want to have Lazard in between us and the seller. It's pretty straightforward, right? So I think it's the easiest to have an angle in a dialogue in sourcing that deal if you have a portfolio company. So we currently have 20 portfolio companies across different parts of the industrial world: automotive, building products, aerospace and defense, energy services. So through those management teams and through those verticals, it becomes easier to source deals. Just thinking about acquisitions we've made, I think a lot of it is really around the CEOs of our portfolio companies, or also combining market knowledge with industries that are going through change. So we're currently talking to a public company that competes with two public companies separately compete with a couple of our portfolio companies. We found those, we've been in direct dialogue with one of those businesses since we made the initial acquisition. And the second one we actually found through really doing screens of companies that are trading at low multiples.
And Lee, maybe to elaborate, particularly in a strategic context, many of the targets that you'd like to acquire, may be reluctant to engage in any kind of proprietary discussions with you just for competitive reasons. What sort of tactics do you use to overcome some of those obstacles to generate a meaningful dialogue with a target that's on the list?
That's a good question, because we have a really consolidated industry. So we're far down the consolidation curve, probably 4 to 5 global players and a couple niche in specific emerging markets. It's a tough discussion because you're really, you're competing versus them head-to-head on a daily basis, and then how do you engage with them? Or you'll find circumstances where the business is embedded in a larger pharmaceutical type company. We kind of blur the line between food and pharmaceutical. And so it's a tough discussion, but I'd say it really starts with building a relationship and articulating our value proposition. It's something that you can't get done overnight, but I think it's building your reputation and what it stands for. I think that goes a long way too.
If I may add to that answer, for us, the one single word that's worked the best for these conversations, for proprietary deals or for add-ons, is collaboration. So if you call someone and says, hey, and they probably know the portfolio company that we have, and say, hey, we'd like to collaborate with you or get together, talk about how we can work together. It's pretty high chance that we're not going to get turned down for that, versus calling and saying, hey, are you for sale? Mm-hmm. The answer there is probably going to be no, we're not for sale. So collaboration is a pretty good kind of buzzword, if you will, to strike those, be a catalyst for those conversations.
And then maybe perhaps a question for Dawn, put you on the hot seat, so to speak. But we're here with Michael Teplitsky from Wynnchurch, and of course we've been talking a lot about private equity over the course of the day today, and the influence that private equity has had on the M&A environment. Dawn, Don, from your perspective, do you see Huron competing in auctions with private equity firms more today than you have in the past?
Yeah, we have actually, especially in the healthcare space. I know that there's a couple auctions that we were in that we tried really hard and we just couldn't compete with them. And it wasn't even a price; it was the structure that they were offering. We're buying a lot of people businesses, so a lot of them still want to kind of retain or have another upside or another play at it that we just can't really offer.
What sort of, given that what you're doing is you're buying businesses that are predominantly made of people, what sort of things what sort of structures do you use to, ensure that post-close that the people that you're buying actually stay within the Huron family?
We've done some retention bonuses, but a lot of it is just kind of trying to spend a lot of focus time on that culture piece on the front end, and directly our leadership spends a lot of time getting to know those leaders. We just closed a deal with Studer Group, which was a $300 million deal, and it was all about the people. So we made sure from day one that we were there on the ground. When the deal was announced, we were at their all-employee meeting. We had, we spent a lot of time kind of prepping and making sure that we were presenting to them the same way we were presenting to investors about why it made sense and really engaging them. We spend a lot of time kind of with that whole hearts and minds planning ahead of deals.
In this day and age, with so much information at our fingertips, and S&P Capital IQ is a great product. There's no shortage of information out there, and in that context, I've found over the years that it's amazing to me that some of the most logical strategics don't end up buying a company that I think makes a lot of sense. And I guess my question is twofold. Number one, are there deals that are on the target list that you believe you should be the owner of that you don't see in a process? Are there deals that you sort of miss, and what steps can you and what steps do you take to make sure that you don't miss deals that are highly strategic?
If I could take that.
Yeah.
It's a good question because just, again, focusing on my industry, people are paying upwards. The last transaction was a 20 times EBITDA multiple, and that was based on pro forma normalized EBITDA. And it was, Nestle in our space. And so you're competing against, some pocketbooks that are pretty big. So you got to have your strategic story lined up. And as the earlier discussion on strategy was spot on, prioritize your targets and be prepared. You never know when that could strike. So if you're not prepared, you don't stand a chance. I think that's especially true in my industry. But to the extent you're capped out, Nestle can make a decision overnight to go buy somebody with the cash on their balance sheet because it's earning zero right now or it's a negative number. So it becomes very difficult to get your strategy executed. So certainly I think there's companies out there that we'd be the better owner of. You blend it into a $300 billion company, it's tough to tell how it's truly performing. But you stay prepared for the opportunity, you never know when it's going to strike.
Dawn, I don't know if you've seen any deals where...
Yeah, I think that in our space we're so focused on industries and what we do that if there's somebody out there, and there have been companies out there that have been, they're just always on our radar. I mean, we've engaged with them previously, our leadership's engaged with them. So we've either had a run at them or there was another reason that we chose not to. And sometimes they chose not to go with a strategic buyer, so we just were left out of it. But it's, anything that's a prime focus for us, we've already had our eye on. There's just so few big players in healthcare consulting space or education space that there's, we know who they are.
Michael, from the perspective of a private equity buyer, how would you characterize today's environment, being a participator in many of the auctions that are taking place, seeking the top most optimal valuation? How would you characterize today's M&A environment from the perspective of a private equity investor?
Yeah, well, the market is insanely competitive, so you better have some sort of an edge. So the way we we view the world as, number one, I think we're going to be the most competitive in situations where we have portfolio companies making an acquisition. In those situations, we can play as a strategic and have some sort of a synergy. So, in fact, a decent number of the transactions we've had in the last couple of years, we were a strategic buyer. Number two, we spend a lot of time in certain industries, and we think we have good executive contacts, and through those contacts, we may have some sort of an operational, strategic, or commercial edge in the process. So we may have a different view on what we can do with the company in terms of growth. Finally, we're pretty opportunistic, so we try to see as many deals as possible, looking at hundreds and hundreds of deals per year. And through those, through different relationships, we're going to see deals that are off the beaten path or have some sort of a story to them, where those companies just aren't perfectly suited for a conventional Lazard auction. And there, that would be our strength, is those tougher deals. There's probably more risk there, but also more upside.
You know, just to tail onto that, I think there's an opportunity that private equity has too that strategics don't have, because there's no $500 million infant formula company I can go acquire. It's maybe a leg of a $1.5 billion company. So to take a swing at that is very difficult. A lot of tax leakage and stuff involved. They can step right in those situations and take advantage of the structure.
I would also add, we try to be pretty nimble and reactive and always thinking about the economic cycle. So we're in the industrials world. The industries that are having some sort of challenges are obviously the energy space. Defense has been soft generally. Agricultural equipment. So we're always looking at these industries and saying, okay, well, can we be proactive in finding companies in that space? Obviously, in the energy world, nobody's going to sell unless they have to right now, so it's going to be the distressed, maybe even distressed debt sales. We've definitely participated in those.
Maybe each of you can give a sense to the folks in the audience, how many deals that you look at perhaps in a given week or a month, and how many of those you, on a percentage basis, make it past the initial vetting stage?
Rough estimate per month, 5 to 10, and few make it past the first stage. I'd say 1 to 2. It's we tend to see a lot of things that aren't core and more adjacent to us that just don't quite make sense. So we tend to pass more than not. But you want to keep those relationships going with the bankers who have that nice deal flow. And you try and educate them a little bit on your strategy, but yeah, it's more passing than not. I would say it picked up a bit last year though in terms of the deal flow at the end of the year. Michael?
So I could tell you in our system we log probably 1,000 deals per year, and our goal is to buy around 3 to 5 companies, 3 to 5 platforms per year, maybe some add-ons. I know it sounds like a very low percentage. I'm including deals where we just got a teaser and didn't really spend a lot of time in the business. Ultimately, I don't know, it's probably, you pursue maybe 40 and you end up with 4 or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I think because we were kind of tracking this for a while, so I think we looked at about 200 deals last year. We did 4 acquisitions and a minority investment. And, at any time we probably have 10 to 20 in our pipeline that is some stage, and probably 60 to 70% of those came inbound versus us sourcing them.
One of the, I'm being on many of my clients, who are looking to sell their business, often ask about valuation and, what my view is on a strategic sale versus a private equity sale and what that means in terms of the delta in valuation. In today's capital markets environment where you have low cost of capital, lots and lots of cash sitting on the balance sheet of large companies, and ability and interest in doing deals, how do you balance the need to deploy capital with the valuation dynamics that are out there today, and how do you remain disciplined in pursuit of acquisitions?
Again, I'll start. In terms of discipline, I think that stays pretty easy for us. We focus on return on invested capital, and what does that compare to our next best alternative, which is typically reinvesting in our growth markets. We have top line 10% sales growth as a company, so we can make the strong case that why disrupt our focus, and so that becomes a pretty easy comparison. The downside is the internal investments have been a little bit more robust than the external opportunities that we've seen, and so it does create an issue for putting cash to work. But it's it's really balancing that versus other alternatives as dividends and or buybacks. And the key issue there is really repatriation of cash. And what does that look like, the net impact?
Michael?
That's a tough question. The market is very competitive. So, and we just raised a new $1.3 billion fund, which is double the size of our prior fund, so it gets especially complicated. I'd say, look, we have a pretty straightforward business model. It's worked for now. We just raised the fourth fund. So we've had successes, we've had failures, we've learned from our mistakes. We invest in complicated deals or situations where there's a story or complexity. We have a straightforward business model, and we know what we're looking for. We pursue companies in industries we like and have experience in, and we look for situations where we can use prudent amount of leverage to earn a fair return. And beyond that, we want to create meaningful value through operational improvements and, excuse me, and strategic improvements and commercial improvements. And if we can't do it, it's not a Wynnchurch deal. It's pretty straightforward.
Don?
Yeah, I would say we're pretty conservative, at least from our mindset, in how we're investing. And it was challenging until we did the Studer acquisition. We had a large amount of capital we had raised, and we were looking to deploy it in healthcare, and finding the right fit was extremely challenging. We walked away from a lot of deals that made us kind of question our own judgment just at the time, because we just knew we had to do something. We had to do something big, and there was just so few options. But then when it was, I think we really stuck to it. And when we found the right opportunity, we spent a lot of time vetting it. We spent a year talking with them and really making sure it was the right fit. But the rest of the stuff we do is kind of small, that there's kind of like that room for error. If you're only spending, a couple million, you kind of get a little more lax on your judgment, probably. But otherwise, we stick strong.
We talked, David, the earlier presenter, talked about the process and timing. How do you, as global organizations, this is more for Lee and for Don, how do you get a global organization to move quickly on a deal that you know needs to be done?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think it starts off with structure. So when you start off thinking about the acquisitions, the way we've structured it, we're very slim and flat here in Glenview, where we're headquartered. 2 or 3 people work in business development at any given point. So we rely on the local countries to bring up the acquisition ideas. We can't tell a company or our local manager in Vietnam what he should go buy from an internet search. So we already raised them up, get them to a regional level, and boiling up to a corporate level, so we can kind of see across the platforms, understand where they're at. Once that's done, it's easy to get everybody pre-aligned. But the actual execution, a time difference, I can't tell you how difficult it is to execute on a deal. You have to be willing to work odd hours, 7 a.m. calls, 9 p.m. calls. But to get everybody strategic aligned, it takes a lot of communication. And I think it's actually a benefit sometimes where you can get twice the work done. So when I'm sleeping, somebody else is working, and you can make a lot of progress swiftly in that regard.
Don?
We kind of, from a corporate structure, I think we've done enough transactions. Everyone's pretty much trained on what they need to do and the timeline in which they need to do it. And we run a very structured process with internal deadlines and calendars to keep everyone in line. Working globally, it becomes a little bit more challenging because we don't have local resources we can rely on. So it's usually getting on a plane and going there and just trying to get it done.
If I could supplement too, we use a lot of advisors. Since we're so skinny here at headquarters, I can't translate Chinese financials into a U.S. GAAP. So we rely upon the PwCs, Deloitte's, E&Ys of the world to help us do that. So we're pretty heavy on using consultants.
Let's talk about perhaps the integration once you buy a business. How do you approach the integration of that target? How do you get involved? How much do you get involved, or do you let it stay, the business that it is?
From my perspective, we're heavily involved. We like to highlight somebody as an integration lead, at the onset, past term sheet execution, because they really have to understand what the deal strategy is. So everything that we're crafting, from a synergy standpoint, they have to be totally aware of. And so, you set up a committee program management office to oversee all that and make sure it gets executed. So heavily involved.
And Dawn, do you have a similar strategy and
It
integration?
is now. I can tell you that honestly, prior to probably about this past year, we just kind of like jammed everything in day one, and it was complete chaos. And then you would come back and do the post-close reviews and found out all the things that you thought were going to happen didn't happen because, so we've kind of taken over the integration function and been much more, we start with kind of key assumptions that we're going in and the beliefs and the milestones and the way that we're going to treat it, whether it's, partial or it's going to set aside, and kind of approach it that way in a much more controlled setting.
There's two kinds of synergies. There's the cost synergies, and then there's the revenue synergies. Give us a little bit of perspective on what the key, elements of achieving both of those types of synergies, both on the cost side and and on the revenue side. Dawn, I'll start with you.
We usually don't assume a lot on the cost side because it's just there's certain things that are just inherent in the way we run our business, and we know a lot of times it's more expensive. When we buy these smaller companies, we're offering better benefits. We're offering all these things.
Cut their salaries.
Yeah. So we usually don't get a lot of cost synergies. And from a revenue synergy side, we try to operate very conservatively. I mean, we do, full kind of customer analysis, only assuming, 5% penetration, do some really conservative calculations, but we can also kind of keep that in our back pocket and not necessarily present that to the street or the board or anything like that.
Michael, I don't know, do you get involved in integration in your role at Wynnchurch?
Sure. Well, yeah, we do. The integration really is run principally by the CEOs of the companies. So we may augment the team, and there have been instances where we've hired consultants to help set up some sort of an integration office. But really, before we buy the business, we're going to have some sort of an integration plan, 90-day plan or 100-day plan to get the business integrated. There have been some deals. We bought a company within the last 12 months where our CEO used to run the business that we acquired, and he took $30 million of synergies out of the combination within 30 days, which is pretty impressive. So we kind of stay out of their way and let them do their thing.
We heard a lot about good deals, bad deals earlier today. Maybe you can share with us some of your perspective on of the bad deals that happen, or the deals that perhaps you shouldn't have done, without getting too specific. What sort of things did you learn, kind of post-mortem, that you've implemented into your approach to doing deals in the future?
Yeah, I don't think anyone wants to claim they've done a bad deal up here.
Next question.
I would say maybe bad processes that we fixed. There was in terms of areas to improve and work on, I think there's always those situations. It's a tough question. I may just say that I learned firsthand that you need to go to on-site due diligence. Kind of a funny story, I'll do it really quickly, but we pursued a company that we didn't buy at one point, and going there, we saw the exit doors were actually bolted shut out of this manufacturing facility, and everything looked good on paper, except for that. And we said, what's behind that? Well, the workers were leaving early. They can't do that. Like, okay. Next question was, why aren't there sprinkler systems installed? Well, we thought about that, but didn't think it was appropriate. But the doors were bolted, and so just learning those type of things about a company firsthand will tell you a lot you need to know about whether it's a good investment or not.
Well, we only have a few more minutes. Maybe we can poll the audience, see if there are some questions for these folks.
I've got a quick question for Mike Teplitsky. Mike, setting aside EBITDA and the specific company kind of story, if you had to pick one or pick companies in one specific industry sector to target right now, what specific sector would that be and why?
It's an interesting question. Look, I think aerospace is a pretty good place to be. There's a big backlog that Airbus and Boeing have on planes, and if you can get a supplier gets plugged into that system, you're in a pretty good position for a while. So I think commercial aerospace.
Your attention.